Hey everyone, welcome back to the read aloud of Love, Treachery, and Other Terrors. Today we're actually going to read 3 chapters because one of the chapters is like 2 pages long, so I figure we can just go ahead and dive right in to chapter 13, Angels Can't Dance. The wedding day came in the blink of an eye. When Alexander and Ilona left the chapel, arm in arm, they found Brother Joseph waiting for them outside the doors. Alexander was about to greet him when Ilona called out, "You cunning devil!" She broke away from Alexander and gave the old man a gentle punch in the shoulder. "What have I done to deserve such a greeting?" he asked. "Don't pretend you weren't planning this," she accused, motioning from herself to Alexander and back again. "Planning what?" he replied, looking exceptionally pleased with himself. "And why didn't you ever tell me you weren't human?" she demanded. "Why did you presume I was human?" His tone was slightly offended, but amusement shimmered in his eyes. Ilona threw her arms around him and hugged him so tight it looked like she was going to snap the frail man in two. The rest of the celebration was uneventful, until Filbert had an epiphany. He claimed he was enlightened by the Holy Spirit, but it was more likely alcohol. He stated that an infinite number of angels can dance on the head of a pin, because angels do not take up space. Florian, similarly enlightened, countered by saying angels can't dance at all because they do not have bodies. The argument escalated, but Alexander was too busy staring wistfully into Ilona's eyes to notice and intervene. Then the archbishop overheard the argument and explained that angels are able to manipulate matter and take the form of humans, as Raphael did in the Old Testament, and therefore they are able to dance. Then every knight, clergyman, and noble present gave their opinion, until finally Filbert punched Florian in the nose, and Florian threw Filbert through a table, and the archbishop hit Florian over the head with a serving platter. And a brawl broke out, which resulted in a bloodied tangle of amateur philosophers and theologians, the likes of which the world had never seen. But by that time, Alexander and Ilona had gone to bed, leaving the kingdom to its fate. The incident was documented in an ecclesiastical history, and was revisited in songs for years afterward. Filbert and Florian loved hearing the event recounted, because neither of them could actually remember it themselves. To Alexander, his wedding was the start of the happiest year of his life. Painting became his primary occupation, and soon every church in Kaltehaven and all the surrounding kingdoms were decorated with his artwork. In his spare time, he was with Ilona in the library. He wanted nothing, except maybe children, and he was sure they would come in God's time. He had all the privileges of royalty, without any of the responsibilities. It was paradise. Then one night, Alexander had a dream. He saw his father standing at the foot of his bed. "There you are, Alexander. I've been looking everywhere for you. What are you doing in Kaltehaven?" His father noticed Ilona asleep beside Alexander. "Wait a moment, did you marry a Celtic girl?" Alexander threw the blanket over her head to hide her golden hair. "No," he answered. "Oh, well, if you had, I would have complimented you on your diplomacy," his father replied. "Why are you here, father?" Alexander asked. "I thought you were dead." "And I thought you were in Calathea," his father replied. "The Calathians didn't want me," Alexander answered, "so I made a wonderful life for myself here." His father grimaced. "Really? In Kaltehaven?" "Yes, father," Alexander scowled. "You need to go home, Alexander. Your people are in danger." "Your sister is in danger," his father said. "What kind of danger?" But Alexander awoke before his father could specify. He tried to dismiss the dream, but the more he ignored it, the more he felt a tugging on his heart, a persistent feeling that Kaltehaven was not where he was meant to be. Chapter 14. Calathea is probably fine. "Let's play a little game," Acacia said, a sinister smile curling on her lips. She was in one of Calathea's old amphitheaters, looking out over the arena. The place was packed with spectators, all looking at her with eyes full of both horror and anticipation. Fausta stood just beside Acacia. No one could see or hear her except the twins, and they ignored her. Standing unseen in plain sight was unnerving. Time and again, she tried to call out to the humans around her. She was unable to touch them. She tried knocking over a water jar to get someone's attention, but it wouldn't budge. Everything she touched was fixed in place, impossible to move. The way people looked right through her made her feel like a ghost. She couldn't do anything the twins didn't want her to do, and in that moment, all they wanted her to do was watch. Beside Acacia stood one of the kingdom's most respected senators. Fausta had never witnessed such fear in his eyes. Jace stood just behind his sister, biting his lip to contain his giddiness. Below, circling the arena, snarling and growling, was a pride of lions. The creatures were the victims of cruelty, scarred and bruised and emaciated. They fought among themselves, their desperation for nourishment turning them against each other. Look there, Acacia said, placing one hand on the senator's shoulder and pointing with the other to two iron gates that opened onto the arena. Behind the first door are 5 villagers. I haven't seen them myself. They might be elders or children. Who knows? Behind the second is a lovely young lady, intelligent, beautiful, and looking forward to a bright future. Oh yes, she's also your daughter. Acacia's grin broadened when she saw the color drain from the man's face. Tell me, Senator Clement, which gate should we open? Neither, was his barely audible reply. If you don't choose, we'll open both, Acacia sneered, and you'll have the blood of all 6 victims on your hands. Jace walked up behind the man and whispered, Do you know what's wonderful about this, Senator? If you choose your daughter, the people will hate you for killing the villagers. But if you choose the villagers, we'll tell everyone that you sacrificed your daughter to win their votes. He smiled gleefully. There's no good outcome for you, I'm afraid. Maybe you'll think twice before opposing us in the future. Fausta felt anger burning through her. Watching these beings abuse her people was torture. Where is the queen? The senator demanded. I want to speak with her immediately. Acacia glanced at Fausta. A hint of a smile touched her lips. Fausta was using every ounce of willpower to keep herself from crying out to him. She knew it was futile and didn't want to give her captors the satisfaction of seeing her react. Why does everyone keep asking that? Acacia laughed. It really is an irrelevant question, Jace added. Why would you need a queen when your gods have returned? This was only the most recent of the twins' cruel games. They regularly gathered the people to witness such events. Each one involved a complex moral dilemma, illustrated with the lives of random citizens. If Fausta had been paying attention, she might have noticed that the new gods never killed anyone themselves. Certainly they would threaten those who opposed them. Lightning would strike the ground immediately beside the person in question. Sometimes the earth would shake, sometimes fire would surround the victim, but each time someone was actually executed, it was a human agent that carried out the order. Not a soul among the Calatheans knew that fairies couldn't kill humans without killing themselves. Few mortals did. One of those mortals was in Caldehaven, trying desperately to distract himself from the awful feeling that was nipping away at his heart. It was only a dream. That's what Alexander told himself whenever he thought back to his father's visit. After he awoke, he asked everyone if they had any news of Calathea. He asked Florian, the friars, the merchants he knew from his time as a candlemaker, but no one could tell him anything. So he tried to push the matter out of his mind and returned to his usual routine. The demand for his artwork was growing so that he could hardly keep up with his commissions. He converted an old storage building near the stables into a workshop. There he spent most of his time. It was luxurious compared to his home in the swamp, though he did have to snatch invasive poultry once in a while and toss them out the window. Ilona was usually out during the day, overseeing the construction of her cathedral. Occasionally, she would spend her day writing letters requesting the support of artists, theologians, and clergymen. She did this from Alexander's workshop, simply for the opportunity to spend time with him. On one such day, as they were each quietly engrossed in their work, Florian entered. Alexander tensed when he felt the king looking over his shoulder. What are you painting? He asked. Theotokos, Alexander answered. Florian scrutinized the image, tilting his head back and forth to better perceive its unfinished form. Why does Saint Theotokos look just like God's mother? He questioned. Alexander died a little inside. Because that's literally what Theotokos means, Ilona answered. Oh, Florian answered. I didn't know that. Everyone knows that, Florian, Ilona explained, and in medieval Caltahaven it was generally true. Alexander turned to face him. Is there something I can do for you, my king? You can give me back my dog, Florian stated. I need him for a hunt. Alexander pointed to a bench along the wall, under which Lonzo was sleeping. I'll thank you to remove him. I've been trying all morning. Florian clapped. Lonzo, up! The old dog opened his eyes, looked over at Florian lazily, and then went back to sleep. Florian gave the animal several more insistent orders, all of which he ignored. The king had to pull him out by the scuff of his neck and throw him over his shoulder. The old dog whined a little, but offered no other resistance. Lonzo was not a small dog, and Florian holding him like so was a testament to his strength. You really expect that animal to hunt? Ilona asked skeptically. He's my best hunting dog, Florian insisted. Was, Ilona corrected. He's little more than a pelt now. Alexander smiled at this. He loved her brutal honesty when it wasn't directed at him. Watch your tongue, Florian replied. Not one of my knights is as loyal as Lonzo. I hope you won't have such difficulty waking them the next time we're under attack, Ilona answered. Florian glared at her, but decided not to engage further. Ilona responded with a satisfied smile as he turned to leave. Your Majesty, Alexander called. Florian turned back to face him. Have you heard any news at all from Calathea recently? Would you like me to send someone there for you? Florian asked. Alexander shook his head. I wouldn't want to burden anyone with such a long journey. It would be better than you burdening me with your constant inquiries. Florian must have noticed the concern in Alexander's eyes, because he softened a bit, and then added, I promise, if I hear anything, I will inform you immediately. Thank you, Alexander replied, turning back to his work. Again he felt Florian scrutinizing his painting. Why are her eyes so big? The king asked. Because she's in the presence of God, Alexander explained. It's symbolic. I don't like it. You should make it realistic, Florian commented. Also, you should make her blonde. God's mother would be blonde. Alexander sighed very deeply and then said, I'll make you a candle any way you want it. My painting is my own. Chapter 15. The Great Schism. Later that afternoon, Alexander and Ilona took a walk around the castle. They spoke about a number of things. Progress of the cathedral, books they were reading, the work of this philosopher or that. As Alexander listened to Ilona, he was struck by her insightfulness and overwhelmed with joy in thinking that he had married a woman so wise. As he leaned in to kiss her, he said something that sounded romantic in his head. You have the face of a cult, but the heart of a Calathean. Instead of a kiss, he received a slap in the face. Let me make something clear, Ilona scolded. This is a cultic heart, and I've a cultic mind, and a cultic soul, and that hand that slapped you was cultic. If you cannot accept that, why don't you sulk back to your superior kingdom and find a woman worthy of you? She stormed off, leaving Alexander to wallow in his stupidity. That night, as he lay under the bench in his workshop, trying to fall asleep, he spun the incident over in his mind. Maybe it was a stupid thing to say, but Ilona was certainly overreacting. He rolled over and scratched Lonzo's head. The filthy creature managed to sneak back in. Alexander would have shoved him out and locked the door, except that he was feeling a bit lonely. As he lay there, quietly brooding, he became aware of a high purring tone, like a cat, but not a cat. He listened again. There was a clucking and the rustling of feathers, and then another purr. He swore to himself. He must have left the window open. He peered out from under the bench and saw a line of chickens huddled on a beam above. He was too frustrated and too exhausted to chase them out. How he longed for civilization, where people and dogs and chickens all knew their place. He spun fond memories of his homeland over and over in his mind, until his eyes grew heavy and he drifted off to sleep. Alexander, someone said. He opened his eyes to see a pair of feet standing in front of his bench. Their owner leaned down to look at him. It was his father. Alexander, what are you doing under there? He asked. I don't want to talk about it, Alexander grumbled. When I couldn't find you in your room, I thought you'd return to Calathea, his father said. I did mention that the Calathians hate me, didn't I? Alexander snapped. Looks like you aren't doing any better with the cults, his father observed. Alexander pulled the dropcloth he was using as a blanket over his face. I should have joined a monastery, he mumbled. So do it, his father answered. And when you encounter difficulties in the monastery, flee to France and hide under another bench. Alexander didn't mean it, of course. He loved Ilona, and figured if he avoided her long enough, the matter would resolve itself. He attempted to apply the same logic to his father, and rolled sideways so he was facing the wall. He wasn't in the mood for a lecture at the moment. Your people are suffering, Alexander. Are you going to return to Calathea, or will you turn your back on them too? Alexander suddenly felt a flicker of anger. Like you turned your back on me, he snapped. He was alarmed at his own boldness. Whenever Justin was drunk? Alexander instantly regretted his outburst when he saw his father's deeply wounded expression. Be a better man than I was, his father replied. Alexander was relieved to find the entire thing had been a dream. Unfortunately, his troubles with Ilona weren't. He spent the next several days sleeping in the same spot until one evening Florian happened upon him. Is she still angry with you? He asked, leaning over so he could see Alexander under the bench that sheltered him. Alexander responded by grumbling something indiscernible. I can't believe you're letting this continue, Florian exclaimed. You're her husband, aren't you? And that's your bed she banished you from, isn't it? Alexander glared sideways at Florian. Technically, it was her bed. After the wedding, she let him sleep in it. So be a man! Return to your room! March right up to her, fall on your knees, and beg for mercy, Florian said. Alexander grumbled something else inaudible, but in the end, he took Florian's advice. He left his workshop and ventured up the winding stairs to Ilona's chamber. He stood outside the door for a long time, trying to work up his courage. He knocked. There was no response. He knew she was in there. He'd seen her go up earlier that evening. He took a breath and entered. She was standing on the opposite side of the room, with her back to him. He could tell her arms were crossed. Ilona? She turned to face him, scowling. I am sorry, he started. I want to make this right. It's, a bit lonely down there. You have the dog, Ilona stated, which I am sure is preferable to a cultic woman. Alexander felt a flash of anger. That was uncalled for, he asserted. Do you think I would have married you if I hated cults? But I'm not a cult, Ilona sneered. I'm a golden-haired Calathian. It was a slip of the tongue, Ilona. Sometimes I just say things. Her expression softened slightly. I didn't mean it, he continued, relaxing slightly. I do it all the time, so there's really no reason to get emotional. All progress was instantly lost. A fire raged in Ilona's eyes. Oh, but you did mean it, she hissed. You're always thinking it, aren't you? Thinking what? About how superior you are. Alexander was stupefied. He had no idea where she was getting that idea. I am not, Alexander objected. Then why are you always correcting me? She asked. What are you talking about? He pleaded. When we're in chapel, you're always correcting my Latin, she complained. Oh, I did it once, Alexander scoffed. You do it every time, Ilona insisted. Do I? Yes, do you have any idea how irritating that is? She was going on. There are just a few words you struggle. Why do you care? Ilona exclaimed. When you say we shouldn't be using Latin in the first place. Well, if you insist on using it, Alexander stated, you should at least use it correctly. And you called the Pope an infidel. I thought we agreed never to talk about the Pope, Alexander reminded. We did, Ilona affirmed, and then you called him an infidel. When was this? Last month, when my uncle was visiting, she said. Oh, for heaven's sake, your uncle started that. He's always talking politics and... The point is, Ilona interrupted, you're always going on about how in Calathea you do things this way or that way, and whatever way it is better than how we do it here. What does that mean? You wish you could go home, don't you? Leave us savages and go back to the civilized world, she snapped. Alexander was silent. He mulled over her words. Ilona, please listen, because you're right about something. I do miss home, miss it terribly. I miss seeing people who look like me. I miss speaking my own tongue. But Ilona, he sighed, you're so stubborn, so incredulous. How do you think for a moment that I'd ever want to leave you behind? Because you wish you'd married someone more civilized, she said. No, I don't, Alexander snapped. And even if I had to forget about Calathea and spend the rest of my days in this... In this what? Ilona dared. In Caltahaven, Alexander dodged. I would do it for you. Ilona regarded him for a long moment. Her silence frightened him. I love you, he added, hoping it would shield him from whatever was coming next. I am trying to decide whether to kiss you or slap you, she explained. May I make a suggestion? Alexander offered. The corner of Ilona's lips turned upward slightly, and when he leaned in to kiss her, she didn't resist. I am sorry, he repeated. I never meant to hurt you. Ilona opened her mouth to speak and then closed it. She was battling with herself about whether or not to say something. He could tell by the way she kept curling her lips. I'm sorry, too, she forced. Alexander raised his eyebrows. He wasn't expecting that. Before he had time to recover from the shock, she grabbed him by the collar and pulled him into another kiss. Then he wrapped his arms around her, and as they were holding each other, she said, It wasn't just you, Alex. I shouldn't have snapped at you like that. I suppose I'm a bit jealous. Jealous? Why? You miss your home, but I'd give anything to leave mine. To be with people who don't look like me, or talk like me, or think like me. That sounds exciting. Escaping the cloister was hard enough. My brothers never let me go anywhere. Believe me, I've tried escaping many, many times. Why didn't you tell me that? He pressed. We can go somewhere. Where? She asked. He kissed her again. Any place you like. Calathea? She teased. Except Calathea, he smiled. Then they spent hours talking about the places they'd like to visit and when they could make their escape, until they grew tired of talking and decided to occupy their time in other ways. Thus the schism in their marriage was healed. Unfortunately, they were not able to resolve the schism in the larger church that evening. But I digress. The entire matter was forgotten, and happiness returned to Erksgrim. For a little while. The end. Not of the book, of chapter 15. Next time we will read chapter 16, where Ida decides to drop in. See you next time.